The world as they knew it had already started to change, though none of them could have predicted how quickly it would spiral out of control. It all began in the most ordinary way, a phone call that seemed like just another piece of bad news amidst the usual chaos of life. The group of friends, scattered across the city, had been going about their routines, working, studying, and meeting up on weekends for their usual dose of laughter and comfort. But this time, things felt different. Jade was the first to notice the subtle shift. She sat in her apartment, staring at the news broadcast on her phone. It wasn't just a few isolated reports of strange attacks. This time, the events were happening all over the world, and they were getting worse. The images of chaotic streets, people running for their lives, and the alarming spread of a bizarre illness were enough to make her uneasy. The news anchor's voice trembled as they mentioned the symptoms: a fever, followed by violent outbursts, and eventually, a complete loss of human consciousness. In the comfort of her home, Jade could only wonder how bad it truly was. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror, tired eyes, a face worn down by too much work and little rest, but there was something else in her gaze: concern. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be easy to ignore. At the same time, across town, her friends were coming to similar realizations. Sarah, a medical student with a sharp eye for detail, had spent the morning sifting through medical journals and online forums, piecing together fragments of information. She had been one of the first to dismiss the idea that this was just a passing flu or a media overreaction. The severity of the symptoms, combined with the speed at which the illness spread, left her with an eerie feeling in her gut. She sent Jade a text. "Have you seen this?" Across town, Ethan had always been the skeptic. He leaned back in his chair at his desk, fingers drumming against the worn surface of his laptop. When Jade's text popped up, he scoffed at the idea. "It's probably just a scare," he replied, not truly believing the weight behind the warning. But as the hours passed and the news began to break into mainstream conversations, even he couldn't deny the creeping sense of fear that was beginning to settle in his chest. The unrest in the streets, the strange, frenzied attacks, it was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. The friends began to check in with each other. What started as casual conversations about a possible flu outbreak quickly turned into discussions about emergency plans and where they could meet if things worsened. It was surreal. Jade, Sarah, and Ethan had known each other for years, bonded by shared experiences, laughter, and their favorite spots in the city. They'd always talked about how great it would be to travel the world together, see new places, and live life without worries. But this was different. The world wasn't just changing, it was unraveling. By the time the sun set that evening, everything felt off. The streets had emptied, the sound of sirens now a constant hum in the distance. Jade stood by her window, watching as people hurried past, eyes wide, their expressions full of fear. It wasn't just an illness anymore, it was chaos. And chaos, once it took hold, never let go. Later that night, the emergency alerts came through, and the world officially took its first step into the unknown. Martial law was declared in several cities, curfews were set in place, and authorities urged people to stay home and limit their contact with others. It felt like the start of a nightmare that none of them had ever imagined. The next morning, Jade packed her things and headed to Sarah's apartment. They needed to stick together, to try to make sense of the madness. Their group of friends wasn't large, only Ethan and Michael were left out of the immediate circle, but the four of them had a bond that could withstand even the most difficult of times. Little did they know, this crisis would test their loyalty and their courage in ways they could never have foreseen. The world had turned on its head, and the friends quickly realized that survival wasn't going to be as simple as staying indoors. Something darker had begun to take shape, something far more terrifying than they could have ever predicted. It wasn't just the spread of an illness that was consuming the world. There was something else, something worse, a force in the shadows that moved with a terrifying sense of purpose. They could feel it, even if they couldn't quite see it yet. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window, made their hearts race. With each passing hour, they were forced to adapt to the world that was quickly slipping away from them. Would they find a way to escape the shadows? Or would they, too, be swallowed by the dark forces at play. One thing was for sure, there was no going back. The lives they had once known were gone, and what lay ahead would demand everything they had left. The next few days blurred together in a haze of confusion and panic. The news seemed to be getting worse by the hour, with reports of strange, violent outbreaks across the country. Jade, Sarah, Ethan, and Michael had holed up in Sarah's apartment, a small but safe haven in a city that was quickly losing its grip on reality. The streets outside were eerily silent, save for the occasional distant sound of sirens or the low murmur of hushed voices. Inside, the group struggled to make sense of the chaos that was unfolding around them. They had no way of knowing who or what was behind this sudden wave of violence, but the evidence was undeniable. The streets were flooded with stories of people attacking others, biting, clawing, and leaving victims to be swept into the madness that was taking over. As Sarah pored over medical journals, trying to find any link between the attacks and the symptoms that were spreading, Jade couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. The reports mentioned individuals losing all sense of humanity, turning into something monstrous, like rabid animals. It seemed impossible, but the footage was undeniable. People were being torn apart in front of their loved ones, and no one knew why. "We can't keep hiding like this," Michael said one evening as the group sat in the living room. He had been quiet for most of the past few days, processing the situation in his own way. But now, with the tension thick in the air, his patience was starting to wear thin. "We need to get out of here." Ethan, who had been less vocal than usual, nodded in agreement. "It's not safe anymore. We need to move while we still can. We have a better chance of surviving if we're not sitting ducks in here." Jade exchanged a look with Sarah. The idea of leaving the safety of the apartment was terrifying, but staying locked away wasn't a viable solution either. They needed supplies, they needed information, and most importantly, they needed to stay one step ahead of whatever was coming for them. "We can't just walk out there without a plan," Sarah cautioned, her voice strained with concern. "We have no idea what's out there. It's not just the infection spreading, it's the violence. People have gone mad. We could be walking right into danger." But Jade, ever the optimist, tried to offer a glimmer of hope. "Maybe we can find a way to get to one of the safe zones. They're saying they've got military checkpoints and emergency shelters. If we can get to one of those, we'll be safe." The idea of safe zones, though appealing, seemed increasingly like a distant fantasy. The news reports hinted at the collapse of order everywhere. Military and police forces were overwhelmed, and many had fallen victim to the strange outbreak. The government had issued a nationwide lockdown, but it was clear that no one was in control anymore. That night, they made a decision. They would leave the apartment and try to make it to a safer location. They packed whatever they could carry: food, water, weapons, and anything else they thought might help them survive. Jade took one last look at the apartment she had once called home. Her heart sank as she realized it might never be the same again. With everything packed, they ventured out into the unknown. The streets were more deserted than ever, the air thick with tension. It was impossible to ignore the unsettling feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting to strike. Jade led the way, her mind racing with possibilities. They had to get to the outskirts of the city, where the government had set up makeshift shelters. But getting there would mean crossing through neighborhoods where danger was lurking at every corner. The first strike came when they were halfway through a quiet residential area. It happened so fast that none of them saw it coming. A figure, hunched and disheveled, staggered toward them from an alleyway. At first, they thought it was a survivor in need of help. But the closer the figure got, the clearer it became that something was horribly wrong. Its face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over bones, eyes glazed with an unnatural hunger. Its mouth opened wide in a grotesque snarl as it lunged at them, its movements jerky and erratic. Before anyone could react, Sarah screamed and grabbed Michael's arm, pulling him back as the figure's hands swiped at the air, narrowly missing them. "Run!" Jade shouted. They bolted, hearts pounding, as the sound of footsteps behind them grew louder. They could hear the figure growling, its voice low and guttural. As they sprinted down the street, they passed others, people who had been hiding, watching the chaos unfold. But none of them stepped in to help. It was every person for themselves. The group ducked into an alley, gasping for breath. They waited, listening for the sound of pursuit, but the figure had disappeared into the shadows. Their hearts were still racing, and the reality of their situation began to sink in. "This is real," Michael said quietly. "We're in this now. No turning back." Jade could see the fear in their eyes, but she knew that they couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The worst was yet to come, and they needed to keep moving. "Keep moving," Jade said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt inside. "We can't let it get to us. We'll find a way through. We always do." The group moved forward, each step heavier than the last. The world they had once known was gone, replaced by a dark and unpredictable nightmare. But as long as they stayed together, they had a chance, no matter how small it seemed. The group moved swiftly through the narrow alley, adrenaline pumping through their veins. Every corner they turned felt like an opportunity for danger to strike, but the silence that surrounded them was worse than any noise they had encountered. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the next disaster to unfold. Jade led the way, her eyes scanning every shadow, every broken window, every abandoned car. Sarah, Michael, and Ethan followed closely, their breaths shallow, their steps quick and deliberate. The adrenaline had momentarily dulled the fear, but it was impossible to ignore the heaviness in the air. The world had changed overnight, and there was no going back. Every decision now felt like a matter of life and death. "Keep moving," Jade whispered, her voice low and strained. They couldn't afford to stop, not when they had no idea who or what was out there. The infected, if that's what they were, could be anywhere, lurking in places they least expected. The plan had been simple: make their way to the outskirts of the city, to one of the government-established safe zones. But every step closer to their destination seemed to take them further away from any sense of safety. The city was a maze of uncertainty, and the streets were more treacherous than they had anticipated. As they turned another corner, they found themselves in an area unfamiliar to any of them. The buildings were run down, the pavement cracked and littered with debris. It was a ghost town, a place that had clearly been abandoned long before the outbreak had taken hold. Ethan stopped abruptly. "Did anyone else hear that?" His voice was barely a whisper, and Jade could see the panic creeping into his eyes. They all listened. For a moment, there was nothing. The sounds of distant sirens and the occasional howl of a wind gust were the only noises, but then, soft at first, a faint shuffling noise reached their ears. Jade felt her blood run cold. It was the unmistakable sound of something moving, stumbling toward them, slow and deliberate. "Hide!" Jade hissed. They darted into the nearest building, a collapsed storefront that looked like it hadn't seen life in years. They crouched behind a pile of rubble, hearts pounding in their chests. The noise outside grew louder, closer. Jade could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. They were no longer in control of their fate. It was as if the world had become an ever-encroaching darkness, closing in on them with every step. Through a crack in the wall, Jade peered out. A figure shuffled into view, hunched over, its clothes torn and stained. It moved like a puppet with its strings cut, jerky and unnatural. Jade's breath caught in her throat. The thing, whatever it was no longer human. It wasn't even a person anymore. "It's one of them," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "The infected. This is what we're up against now." Jade nodded grimly, her mind racing. They had heard about the infected, people who had lost their minds, become violent, and who could no longer be reasoned with. But seeing it firsthand was another thing entirely. The way it moved, the look in its eyes, it was like watching a nightmare come to life. And that nightmare was now their reality. The group held their breath as the creature moved past their hiding place, its head swiveling as if searching for something, anything. Jade's grip on her backpack tightened, and she signaled for everyone to stay still. They had to remain quiet, remain hidden. One wrong move could be their last. The thing passed them by, oblivious to their presence, and continued its slow, erratic path down the street. Jade exhaled in relief, but the fear still gnawed at her insides. This wasn't the worst of it, she knew. There were more out there, more people who had been changed into something unrecognizable. And if they were going to survive, they couldn't let their guard down for a second. "Okay," she whispered once the danger had passed, "we need to keep moving. But we can't go in the open. We have to find another route." Ethan, his face pale, nodded. "What if we just stay here? Wait it out. Maybe this will all blow over." Jade shook her head. "We don't have that luxury. The longer we stay here, the more vulnerable we become. We're on our own now, and we can't count on anyone coming to help. Our best chance is to keep moving." They continued on, taking a series of alleyways and side streets, always staying out of sight. The city felt like a maze, its once familiar layout now alien and oppressive. Every corner they turned seemed to reveal a new danger, sometimes human, sometimes something else entirely. The air was thick with tension, and Jade could feel the weight of every decision. Their journey to the safe zone, once a hopeful goal, now felt like a distant dream. By the time they reached the outskirts of the city, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving them to navigate in the dim light of street lamps and fading daylight. The air was cold, and the streets were eerily quiet. No one had been around for hours. No sounds of movement. It was as if the city had been swallowed up by the darkness, consumed by the chaos that had begun in the shadows. Just as they thought they were nearing safety, the worst happened. They turned a corner, and there, standing in the middle of the road, was a barricade. But it wasn't made of wood or metal. No, this barricade was formed by people who had clearly lost all sense of humanity. Their eyes were wild, their clothes torn and stained. They moved toward the group in unison, their bodies twitching, their hands reaching out with a ferocity that was unmistakable. Jade's heart raced. The infected were no longer just in the shadows. They were everywhere. "We need to run," Michael said, his voice filled with urgency. Without a word, they bolted. The safe zone wasn't far now, but the path was filled with dangers that were rapidly closing in around them. They had to make it. They couldn't afford to lose everything they had worked for. The darkness was relentless, and it would take everything they had to escape it. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the narrow alley as Jade, Sarah, Ethan, and Michael ran for their lives. Their hearts raced in unison, and the thud of their shoes on the cracked pavement was the only sound that filled the air, until the groans and shrieks of the infected pierced the night. The barricade of crazed people had been just the beginning. There was no place to hide anymore, no safe corner to crawl into. Every step forward felt like a leap into an abyss that only seemed to grow deeper with every passing second. "Keep moving!" Jade shouted, her voice tight with panic. The world had narrowed down to only one thing: survival. They couldn't afford to stop, not now, not when their lives were hanging by a thread. But the infected weren't far behind. They could hear the growls and erratic footsteps growing closer with every heartbeat. As they rounded another corner, a series of gunshots rang out, and the group instinctively dropped to the ground. The harsh crack of gunfire was quickly followed by the unmistakable shuffling of the infected. There was no mistaking it now, they were surrounded. "What the hell was that?" Sarah gasped, her voice shaky but still carrying a sense of urgency. Jade's eyes darted around, trying to find any sign of an escape route. There was nothing but abandoned cars and shattered glass. The area was desolate, empty, save for the growing threat that was now closing in on them. "We're not alone," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible as he scanned the area. "Someone else is out here." It wasn't long before they saw the source of the gunshots. A small group of survivors, dirty, battered, and clearly on edge, emerged from a nearby building, weapons in hand. They seemed to be just as lost and terrified as Jade and her friends, their faces grim with the weight of the situation. One of them, a man with a grizzled beard and dark, haunted eyes, motioned for them to move quickly. "Get in here," he barked. "We don't have time for questions. They're coming." Without hesitation, Jade grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the building. Michael and Ethan followed close behind. As they rushed inside, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening thud. The dim light inside offered little comfort as they stood in the shadowy interior, surrounded by strangers. The man with the beard didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Who are you? Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice harsh but tired. Jade glanced at her friends, then back at him. "We're trying to get to one of the safe zones. But we're being hunted. We don't know who to trust anymore." He studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on her eyes as if searching for a lie. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. "Safe zones, yeah, they're supposed to be secure, but you'll be lucky if you make it there alive. They're not what they claim to be. Too many people have been turned away or, worse, attacked by others just trying to survive." Jade's stomach twisted at his words. The hope that had been burning inside her, the flicker of light at the end of their journey, began to dim. If even the safe zones weren't safe, where could they go? Then where? Ethan asked, his voice low, the weight of their situation sinking in. The man's face softened, just slightly, as he took in the group of 4. "You can stay here for the night. We'll figure it out in the morning. But you can't stay long. You're not the only ones looking for shelter, and this place won't last forever." The group exchanged glances, silently weighing their options. They had no other choice. The night was their only reprieve from the chaos outside. They nodded in unison, the decision made without words. As they settled into the dimly lit room, the man introduced himself. "Name's Luke. The others are Jack, Vanessa, and Kayla." He gestured toward the others, who sat in the corners of the room, their faces tired but alert. "We're not looking for trouble," Jade said cautiously, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "We just want to survive." Luke gave a sharp nod. "That's the only thing that matters now. Trust me, none of us are here by choice. The world's broken, and we're all just trying to pick up the pieces." The silence that followed was heavy. Jade could feel the weight of his words, the reality of what they were facing pressing down on her like a physical force. They had no illusions anymore. Survival meant making hard choices, and sometimes those choices didn't come with the comfort of knowing what was right or wrong. As the night wore on, the group huddled together, trying to sleep despite the constant fear gnawing at their nerves. Outside, the sounds of distant cries and the shuffling of the infected served as a grim reminder that they weren't safe, not really. But for now, the building was secure. And for the first time in days, Jade allowed herself to close her eyes, even if just for a few hours. In the darkness of the room, as the others drifted off into a restless sleep, Jade stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. What if the safe zones were a lie? What if there was no place left for them to go? What if this world was already lost, and survival was just an illusion? But she couldn't dwell on those questions, not now. Not when they had a chance to fight, to survive, to escape the shadows that were closing in on them. Tomorrow, they would face the next challenge. Tomorrow, they would take the first step toward whatever new world lay ahead of them, one they had to carve out for themselves, because no one else would. And with that thought, Jade finally let herself drift into a restless sleep. The shadows outside crept ever closer, but inside, they had found a brief moment of peace. For now, that was enough. The morning came too soon. Jade awoke with a start, her eyes snapping open as the sounds of the world outside filtered through the cracked window. The soft rustle of wind against the debris, the distant screeches of infected, and the occasional murmur of someone shifting in their sleep reminded her of the fragile peace they had found in the abandoned building. But it was just that, fragile. She sat up, her body stiff from the cold and restless sleep. The others were still asleep, huddled in the corners of the room or lying on makeshift bedding made from torn blankets and old jackets. The light that filtered in through the cracks was weak, casting long shadows across the room, and for a moment, Jade just sat there, lost in thought. It was hard to remember what normal had even felt like anymore. Days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last, marked only by the ever-present fear and uncertainty. She glanced around the room at the others. Michael, Ethan, and Sarah were still asleep, but Luke and the others, Vanessa, Jack, and Kayla, were already awake, quietly conversing in the far corner. Jade had been hoping for some time to figure out who to trust, but the more she saw of Luke's group, the more she realized that trust in this new world was a fragile thing. Everyone was in survival mode, and alliances were as temporary as the roof over their heads. "Morning," Luke said quietly as Jade stood up. He had been watching her, his eyes dark but not unkind. There was an understanding in his gaze, a silent acknowledgement that they were all in this together, even if it was only for the moment. "Morning," Jade replied, forcing a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone began to stir. They knew the routine now: wake up, gather supplies, and make a plan. But the plan, always, was clouded by uncertainty. There was no real map to navigate this new world, no clear path forward. The infected had destroyed everything, leaving only ruins in their wake. After a brief, uncomfortable silence, Luke cleared his throat. "We need to get moving. The longer we stay here, the more exposed we become. It's only a matter of time before others come looking for this place." "What about the safe zone?" Michael asked, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "We were told they're safe, that we could make it there." Luke's face hardened, and Jade noticed a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "The safe zones are a lie. If they were truly safe, we wouldn't be out here, scavenging for survival. The government set them up, sure, but they've long since been overrun or abandoned. I don't trust them." The words hit Jade harder than she expected. She had clung to the idea of the safe zone like a lifeline, a beacon of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still something left worth fighting for. But if Luke was right, if the safe zones were just another lie, what did that mean for them? What were they even fighting for? "Then what's our next move?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. She was sitting on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, eyes wide with uncertainty. Luke sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "We head south. There's a settlement, a small group of survivors who managed to hold their ground. They have supplies, food, weapons. It's our best shot." Jade didn't know whether to trust Luke's words or not. He seemed earnest enough, but how could they know for sure? For all she knew, this could be another trap, another false promise of safety. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized they had no choice. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't wait for the infected to come to them. They needed to move, to keep pushing forward. The group packed up their belongings quickly, each person moving with the same sense of urgency. No words were exchanged as they gathered what little food they had left, weapons in hand. Every sound outside made them jump, every creak of the building felt like a harbinger of doom. The world had become a place where even silence could kill. Jade caught Michael's eye as they left the building. There was a question in his gaze, one she knew he was too afraid to ask aloud. What if they were wrong? What if they were leading themselves into an even worse situation? But they had to go. They had no other option. The city stretched out before them, a vast, decaying landscape of empty streets and hollow buildings. As they moved through the abandoned neighborhood, Jade felt the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. She had no idea what lay ahead, no way of knowing if this settlement was real, if it was even safe. But she pushed the thoughts aside. They had made it this far, hadn't they? They couldn't give up now. Hours passed as they moved through the ruins, taking care to stay out of sight, moving only when it was safe. The city had become a labyrinth of destroyed roads and broken landmarks, and Jade couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep going. When they finally reached the outskirts of the city, the sun was beginning to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the horizon. The world was quiet now, almost unnaturally so, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, more menacing. "Just a little further," Luke urged, his voice strained. Jade could hear the desperation in his voice, and she knew that they couldn't afford to stop now. The settlement, their last hope for safety, was within reach. But as they turned the corner, a shriek split the silence. A group of infected, their eyes wild with hunger, staggered into view. They had been waiting for them. The group froze, the sudden danger pressing in from all sides. Jade's pulse quickened. They had to move, and fast. Their brief moment of hope was slipping away, replaced by the dark reality of the world they were living in. "Run!" Luke shouted. Without hesitation, they took off, their legs pumping, hearts pounding as the infected gave chase. The settlement was so close. They just had to make it. The group ran through the desolate streets, their breaths ragged, hearts pounding. Jade's legs burned with every stride, but there was no time to slow down. Behind them, the infected moaned and groaned, a relentless tide of hunger that grew louder with every passing second. They were gaining, their twisted forms moving with surprising speed despite their decay. "Faster!" Luke shouted, his voice a mix of urgency and fear. His broad shoulders hunched forward as he led the way, his eyes darting from side to side, calculating the quickest route to safety. But the settlement, what they thought would be their salvation, still felt miles away. Jade's mind raced, trying to keep up with her body, but every twist and turn in the maze of crumbling buildings felt like another trap closing in. The city around them had become a jungle, a labyrinth of death where the walls seemed to close in on them at every corner. There was nowhere left to hide. As they sprinted down another alley, Michael's voice broke through the chaos. "We're not going to make it. There's too many of them." Jade didn't have the luxury of replying. They all knew the truth, there were too many infected in too little time. But in her heart, she couldn't bring herself to accept defeat. Not yet. Not after everything they had been through. Suddenly, there was a shout from up ahead. "This way!" It was Jack, one of Luke's companions, waving frantically from the edge of the alley. He had found something, a narrow passageway between two crumbling walls that led into the heart of the settlement. Without hesitation, Luke veered toward the opening, leading the group toward the safety of the small enclave they had been hoping for. Jade, Sarah, Ethan, and Michael followed close behind, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the city streets. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through one by one. Jade's breath caught in her throat as she felt the heat of the infected drawing nearer. The sounds of their relentless pursuit grew louder, the thumping of their decaying feet an ominous reminder that they were running out of time. Just as they reached the end of the narrow path, the first of the infected stumbled into view, its bloodshot eyes fixed on them with a single-minded hunger. Ethan, in the front, whirled around, grabbing a rusty pipe from the debris nearby. Without thinking, he swung it with all his might, knocking the creature back and buying just a moment of space. "Go! Go! Go!" Luke shouted, pulling Sarah through the last of the narrow passage. They reached the end, the sounds of the infected just behind them. But before they could fully escape, the ground beneath their feet shifted, the crumbled remnants of the building collapsing behind them, trapping some of the infected within the ruins. But their relief was short-lived. As the group tumbled out of the alley into the settlement, they found themselves face to face with yet another obstacle. This time, it was human. A makeshift barricade stood between them and the open space of the settlement, armed guards standing atop it, their eyes cold and calculating as they surveyed the group. One of them, a tall woman with a scar running across her cheek, raised her rifle. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. "What do you want?" Jade barely had time to process what was happening before the leader of the group, Luke, stepped forward. "We're survivors," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We've been on the run from the infected. We need shelter, food, and medical supplies. Please. We've been through hell." The woman eyed them warily, her rifle still trained on Luke, but something softened in her gaze as she looked at their ragged, exhausted faces. "Survivors, huh?" she muttered. "You all look like you've seen the worst of it." "We have," Sarah said, her voice raw. "Please. We don't want trouble. Just a chance to catch our breath." The woman hesitated, clearly weighing the decision. Behind her, the other survivors stood tense, weapons raised, their distrust of strangers palpable. "Let them through, Delilah," another man's voice came from behind the barricade. It was a calm, authoritative voice, and Jade's eyes shifted to see the speaker, a man with dark, sunken eyes and a weathered face. His gaze fixed on Luke before turning to the others. "They've been through enough." Reluctantly, Delilah lowered her rifle and waved for the others to move aside. The barricade creaked as it was pulled open, just wide enough for them to slip through. The group entered the settlement, a sigh of relief escaping from everyone as they crossed the threshold. But even as the door clanged shut behind them, Jade couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another beginning, not the end. Inside, the settlement looked more like a fortified camp than a place of peace. People moved cautiously, eyes flicking between each other, exchanging wary glances as they passed. They had survived the apocalypse by becoming just as guarded as the world outside. "Welcome to Haven," the man with the weathered face said, his voice softening as he led them further into the camp. "It's not much, but it's ours." Jade looked around, taking in the bare necessities: tents set up under the shadow of tall, improvised walls, makeshift watchtowers, and a few cooking fires crackling in the distance. It wasn't paradise. It wasn't what they had hoped for. But in this world, it was the closest thing to salvation they could find. "We'll take care of you," the man continued, giving them a weary but genuine smile. "You're safe here, for now." The words should have comforted Jade. They should have brought peace. But as she glanced at her friends, she realized something: this wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning of something darker, something they would have to face together. And in that moment, Jade understood one truth: no matter where they went, the shadows of the past would always follow. The question was, how long could they outrun them? Days passed in the settlement, though time seemed to blur together. Haven, as the survivors had named it, was a refuge from the chaos outside, but it came at a cost. The walls that kept the infected at bay also kept the people inside tightly controlled, and despite the initial sense of relief, the group soon realized that even this fragile peace was laced with tension. Jade spent the first few days in the settlement helping with the most basic tasks: scavenging for food, fortifying the barricades, and trying to regain some semblance of normality. The days were long and exhausting, and the nights were worse, filled with the distant howls of the infected and the unnerving sounds of creaking metal from the settlement's walls. But despite all of this, there was an unsettling calm in Haven that Jade couldn't ignore. It felt like the calm before a storm, a tension hanging in the air, unspoken but ever-present. One evening, as Jade sat near the fire, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach, Luke approached her, his face drawn with worry. "We need to talk," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. Jade stood, following him a few paces away from the fire, away from prying eyes. The night was colder than usual, and the wind carried a chill that cut through her jacket. She shivered but ignored it, her eyes searching Luke's face for clues. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke hesitated for a moment, as though he were unsure whether to say what was on his mind. "Something's off about this place," he said, his tone tight. "I've been talking to some of the others, and I don't like what I'm hearing. People go missing. They're getting sick, some of them are starting to act strange." Jade frowned, feeling the knot in her stomach tighten. "What do you mean, act strange? Are they infected?" "No," Luke said, his eyes darkening. "At least, not in the way we know. But there's something off about them. They're not right. I've seen people disappear during the night, and the guards, they've been acting strange too. It's like they're hiding something." Jade felt a pang of unease. Haven had seemed like a safe place, a haven from the horrors of the world outside, but now Luke's words made her wonder if there was more to the story. She'd noticed the quiet whispers among the residents, the furtive glances exchanged between the camp's leaders. But she hadn't wanted to jump to conclusions. Now, though, the nagging sense that they had traded one danger for another was hard to ignore. "What do you think we should do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. Luke looked around before leaning in closer, his voice barely audible. "We need to find out what's really going on here. I don't trust them. I don't trust anyone who's been here longer than we have. There's something they're not telling us, and I'm not sure how much longer we can stay here." Before Jade could respond, she felt a hand on her shoulder, making her jump. She turned quickly to find Michael standing behind her, his expression tense and concerned. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the area as though searching for threats. Jade nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, just talking. Michael didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press. Instead, he lowered his voice and looked directly at Luke. What's going on? Luke's eyes flicked between the two of them, then he sighed. I think there's more to this place than we're being told. People are disappearing. I've seen some weird things. We need to find out what's really happening here. Michael exchanged a glance with Jade before nodding, his jaw clenched. I agree. We need answers. Suddenly, a loud voice called from the center of the camp, cutting their conversation short. It was Delilah, the guard who had initially let them in. She was standing by the fire, shouting orders. Everyone! Gather up! The leaders want to speak with you. Jade felt the tension in the air shift, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She exchanged a glance with Luke and Michael, and the three of them began to make their way toward the center of the settlement, where the rest of the survivors were already gathering. The leaders of Haven stood on a raised platform, their eyes scanning the crowd, their faces impassive. The man who had welcomed them in earlier, the one with the weathered face, was there too. He stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. We have some important matters to discuss, he began, looking down at the crowd. There are rumors going around, rumors of sickness, of people disappearing. I want to assure you all that we are doing everything we can to maintain order and security here. Jade's stomach twisted as she listened. The man's words were smooth, rehearsed, but there was something in his eyes, something cold, that sent a chill down her spine. We've had to make some difficult decisions for the good of this community, he continued. Some people may not agree with those decisions, but they're necessary. We need to ensure that Haven stays strong. Jade's heart began to race. She exchanged another quick look with Luke and Michael. This wasn't the speech of someone who was telling the truth. This was the speech of someone who was covering up something darker. Before she could react, the man's gaze shifted, locking onto them. I trust you all understand the importance of maintaining unity, he said, his tone pointed. Those who are not with us will not be allowed to remain. The implications of his words hung in the air like a thick fog. Jade's mind raced as she realized what this meant. Haven wasn't a sanctuary, it was a prison, and they were being watched. They weren't just surviving the apocalypse. They were being controlled. Luke's grip tightened around his pack, his expression darkening. Unity, the leader repeated, his voice cold. It's what keeps us alive. And in that moment, Jade realized the truth. They had escaped one nightmare, but they were now trapped in another. And it would take everything they had to survive the darkness that was closing in around them. The days following the leader's speech were tense and suffocating. The once predictable rhythms of life in Haven had fractured, leaving the survivors on edge. Jade could sense the shift in the air, as though the walls of the settlement had become more than just a physical barrier. They were becoming psychological ones too, silent, unspoken rules that everyone had to obey, or risk facing the consequences. Jade, Luke, Michael, and Sarah huddled together as they tried to make sense of what they had learned. The words from the leader rang in their ears, echoing louder than ever. Unity. It was the perfect word for control, for a community bound by fear. The others in the camp had grown distant, eyes constantly watching each other, never fully trusting anyone else. The whisperings that had once been rumors were now outright accusations. People were disappearing, again, and no one seemed to know why. The guards were tighter than ever, and the camp's leadership made it clear that there was no room for dissent. We can't stay here, Luke said one night, his voice low but resolute. Not if we're being controlled like this. Jade nodded in agreement. They'd survived so much, but the walls of Haven were closing in on them in a different way now. They could feel the grip of something darker lurking behind the settlement's walls, something more dangerous than the infected, something human. But escaping wouldn't be easy. Haven was surrounded by a dense, hostile forest, and beyond that, only the endless wasteland awaited them. The infected roamed freely, hungry and relentless. Yet, somehow, Jade couldn't shake the feeling that beyond the settlement's oppressive walls, there might be a sliver of hope. A chance at freedom. The group spent days plotting, observing, and gathering what little information they could. There was a vulnerable spot in the eastern wall, an old breach that had been hastily patched up, but it was barely reinforced. Jade knew that if they could get past the guards, that was their way out. It would take precision, timing, and a whole lot of luck. "Tonight's the night," Michael said as he surveyed the small map they'd drawn of the settlement's layout. "We move when the change shift happens. The guards will be distracted." Jade felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she glanced at the others. This was it, the point of no return. If they were caught, they would never get another chance. Haven would swallow them whole. But if they succeeded, they would finally taste freedom. That night, the four of them slipped into the shadows, moving carefully through the camp. They stuck to the paths they knew, avoiding the watchful eyes of the guards. Every sound seemed to carry too far, every movement too risky. But they pushed on, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they approached the eastern wall, Jade felt the weight of what they were doing. Was this the right choice? Would they survive what lay beyond? The unknown stretched out before them, a blank canvas full of threats and dangers. But then she saw it, the weak point in the wall, just as they'd planned. With a nod from Luke, they approached cautiously. Michael was the first to step forward, using a crowbar to pry open the makeshift reinforcement. The metal groaned as it gave way, but the sound was swallowed by the night. They had done it. They were through. But their escape wasn't as quiet as they had hoped. Just as they began to slip through the gap, a voice rang out from the darkness. "Stop right there." The group froze, their hearts stopping in their chests. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a familiar face. It was Delilah, the guard who had let them in when they first arrived. Her rifle was aimed directly at them, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence, heavy, suffocating. Jade's mind raced, her instincts screaming to run. But Delilah didn't move. She stood there, frozen in place, her eyes flicking between each of them. "You're leaving," Delilah said, her voice softer than Jade had expected. "We don't belong here," Luke replied, his voice steady. "You know that. We can't live like this. We have to try." Delilah's gaze hardened, but there was something else in her eyes, something softer. "I can't let you go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll never survive out there. It's not just the infected. It's everything else." "We'll take our chances," Sarah spoke up, her voice firm but calm. "We have to." For a moment, Jade thought Delilah might raise her weapon. But then, unexpectedly, the guard lowered her rifle. She took a step back, her face conflicted. "You're not the only ones who feel trapped here," she muttered. "But I can't help you. Not without risking my life, and everything I've built here." Her eyes flickered to the others, and in that brief glance, Jade saw a spark of understanding. Delilah stepped aside, gesturing toward the opening they had made. "Go," she whispered. "Just, don't look back." Without a second thought, Jade stepped through the opening. The rest of the group followed quickly, leaving the camp behind them. For the first time in days, they felt the weight on their shoulders lighten, if only slightly. As they ran into the night, the cold wind whipping through their hair, Jade glanced back one last time. Haven stood behind them, a dark silhouette against the distant, fading light. It was a place that had promised them safety, but in the end, it was just another cage, another false hope in a world that had long since lost its innocence. And as the group ran into the unknown, Jade knew that they were no longer running from the infected. They were running towards something greater, the possibility of a life that wasn't defined by walls, by fear, or by control. They were running toward freedom. The journey ahead was uncertain, and dangers lurked at every corner, but for the first time in a long while, Jade could see the faintest glimmer of hope, a light at the end of the tunnel. It might not lead to an easy future, but it was a future they could choose for themselves. And that was worth everything.